Hello. Today I'm taking a look at a wine from the Douro Valley in Portugal. Not a port, but a red still table wine. This is Quinta de Crasto Superior from 2018. And Quinta de Crasto, really quite a historic estate, founded in 1615, and in fact on the property between 1758 and 1761 the Marquis de Pombal defined the port region, making it one of the first defined wine producing regions in the world. And he did that by putting stone marker posts down to define the outlines of the region, and there's one of these marker posts actually at Quinta de Crasto, showing that it lies just inside the original port producing area rather than otherwise. So yes, there's this long history of producing port, but it wasn't until 1994 that the estate was able to make and market its own wines, when there was a change in the law that allowed these individual estates to sell their wines rather than having to sell them onto other companies that blended and bottled them. So very rapidly they established quite a reputation, not just for their ports, but also for their red table wines. I mean, for instance, their Vinhas Maria Teresa is a wine that you ever get the chance to try. I mean, it's very expensive, but it's an absolutely exceptional example of a Douro table wine. So having really only started selling their own wines in 1994, the family here, the Roquette family, Lauren and George, who are actually Lauren, the fourth generation of her family to run the estate here, decided that they needed to expand. So in 1990 purchased an estate called Quinta de Cabrera in the Douro Superior region, so upriver from the Cima Corgo. What was actually, until then, a region that was quite sparsely populated, that had had actually very little connection with the outside world. There hadn't been much of electricity there, so it had made it quite difficult to develop the region. But as Portugal had joined the EU and was getting funding to improve its infrastructure, this area became more developed quite rapidly. Now, Quinta de Cabrera is on the south bank of the Douro Valley, facing north. And, you know, that may be counterintuitive in terms of vineyards in the northern hemisphere, but actually because this is quite far inland, you'll often get temperatures in the midsummer up to sort of 45 degrees C. So actually north-facing vineyards are essential to ensure that it doesn't get too hot for the vines to function. It's also worth realising that annual rainfall here is not sufficient to sustain vine growth every year, so it's necessary to irrigate in the Douro Superior as well. The estate here is 150 hectares, making it almost twice the size of Quinta de Crasto itself, and they actually planted 110 hectares of vines here. There were 4 hectares of old vines already planted, so they have 114 hectares here. And the estate lies at somewhere between about 130 and 450 metres above sea level, and that altitude's quite important to ensure that there's a cooling, moderating influence on the heat that actually allows the grapes to retain some freshness once they're ripened. 2018 was a vintage where rain came quite late in the season. There was actually quite a dry winter, but then the early summer saw heavy rains and there were issues with mildew between budding and flowering. However, a hot, dry August and September ensured that the grapes were able to fully ripen, and relatively cool nights gave good fresh acidity. The blend for this wine is a fairly classic blend of traditional port varieties, so Touriga Nacional, Tinta Franca, Tinta Roriz, with a small amount of Suzao just included in the blend to give good freshness to help the wine's acidity, but they don't use too much of that because it can make the structure a little rustic and a little astringent if too much Suzao is included in the blend. The grapes were picked by hand, they were picked into shallow plastic bins, were then transported to Quinta de Crasto and the wine was made there. On arrival, the fruit went onto sorting tables and was very carefully sorted, and then it was destemmed and just very gently crushed. Fermentation took place in temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks. Now, I don't know anything about the way in which extraction was controlled here, or the vatting time that was allowed. However, the wines were transferred into French oak barrels and aged there for a year. I'm not given any indication of whether those are new or old. Possibly there was a portion of new, but I don't have that information. So, let's see what we make of the wine, shall we? Looking at it, you've got a lovely deep, dark colour there. It's a ruby red, it's almost a sort of a black ruby. There are purple notes at the rim. The wine has 14% alcohol, and it's forming quite noticeable tears, and they're quite dark. They're staining the glass. So that's all consistent with what we'd expect for the wine. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas are quite wild and complex. You have lovely, deep, rich notes of sort of damson and bullace, those dark plum sort of notes. There are chocolatey hints. There's touches of spice. There's more lifted, sort of slightly red fruit notes, sort of red plum. Maybe notes of blackberry. And over the top of that, it's not really quite dusty, but it's almost like a sort of a crumbled granite note. There's something quite sort of mineral and yet quite earthy about it. And yet at the same time, it's quite a clean earthiness. It's like I say, like crushed rock. And perhaps there's a dusting of sort of just a herbal, almost if it was French, you'd say garrigue sort of note over the top there. There's certainly plenty going on, and there is an underlying sort of chocolatey, licoricey richness to the fruit. So let's taste. The wine is dry, structured and rich. The structure is giving an almost sort of slightly spicy note to the attack. There's a lovely juicy raspberry through to boysenberry to maybe loganberry note. It's almost you're seeing a progression of a spectrum through red fruits towards more black fruits, and we're going towards damson sort of richness there. And there's almost a licoricey concentration to the mid palate. There are chocolatey textures, a tannic smoothness there. There are fine tannins, there are plenty of those, but they have a ripeness, and there is a suppleness as well as having a little bit of grip there. So, this is really quite an accomplished wine. It's got lovely fresh acidity, I'll say that, and that's lifting the finish. There are some quite elegant sort of dark fruit perfume, whether it's juicy cherry or perhaps more juicy plum sort of notes on quite a long finish. The alcohol certainly is giving roundness to the wine, but seems to be balanced with the quite rich fruit. The core of fruit is perhaps a little bit tight and still a little brut, and will probably open with a bit of time. The wine is really quite approachable now. It has a fair grip on the mid palate that sort of fades a little and allows more of the rich sort of mulberry, cherry, dark plum note to come through on the finish. But yes, while I don't think you need to age it for a long period because it is quite accessible, I'm sure that given its concentration, its alcohol, its acidity, this is a wine that could be aged for up to 10 years yet. So yes, that was Quinta Crasto Douro Superior from 2018. Thank you so much for joining us for this tasting. If you've enjoyed it, if you found it interesting, please press the like button. Please consider signing up and following us on YouTube. That would be fantastic to have your support. Any feedback you have, please leave that in the box below. We'd love to hear what you think about the wines, the tastings we're doing, or anything else related to that. Feel free to share the video with your friends if you think they'd be interested in it. But most importantly, do please try and find some time and come and join us for another tasting in the very near future, won't you? Thanks again. Bye for now.